Hello, this is your host, Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe and hit the notification bell. Don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and Telegram. You can support me on Subscribestar, Buy Me a Coffee, and Locals. You can interact with the channel directly on Locals, make recommendations for other content and shows, and possible guests to talk to and appear, as well as checking out my Substack, where I can go into more detail on some of these other topics. So, why I'm not a new atheist. Now, there's a lot of ways I could talk about this, but the way I'm going to talk about it is more from a philosophical angle. I mean, we could talk about all sorts of problems with the new atheist movement. I was initially going to title this Why I'm Not a Materialist or I'm Not an Atheist, but then some people thought, well, was that actually clear enough? Because there's two specific bad ideas that the new atheists were propagating. One is non-reductive physicalism, and the other one is empiricism. And these are the two bad ideas that I'm going to critique today. So let's begin with the definition of the first bad idea. What is non-reductive physicalism or materialism? So we could say that materialism is the belief that all that exists is matter and energy. A little more precise is physicalism, where everything is physical. Physicalism comes in two kinds, reductive and non-reductive. Non-reductive physicalism lies outside of the scope of today's show. It's a very small group within physicalism. It mostly exists in universities and philosophy departments. Most physicalists are non-reductive. Most scientists are atheists, 85%, and they come in the non-reductive physicalist kind. And this is the really just a completely ridiculous, childish, infantile, bad idea. So why is reductive physicalism false? Well, one of the claims there's two central claims. One is that all that exists is physical, so there's no metaphysical things like souls, God, ideas, whatever. They don't exist. And then reductive, the key debate here is with the mind. So the mind is reducible to the brain, or to state it as concisely as possible, that all mental states are reducible to brain states. Because, in fact, there's no real difference. It's physicalism. There can't be anything like that. So let's look at, there's basically broadly two ways of dealing with the claims of physicalism. One is to prove that there actually are other non-physical things in the world. And then two, that the mind and the brain are not identical, i.e. the mind is some non-physical thing in the world. That's the reductive part. So let's begin with proving that we have non-physical things in the world. Physical goods or physical objects are scarce. So what do I mean by scarce? Well, Stefan Kinsella gives a good definition of scarcity in his Against Intellectual Property. A good is scarce if there can be conflict over the good by multiple human actors. So, for example, if I have a cheeseburger and I want to eat it, and I have a friend who also wants to eat it, we both can't eat the cheeseburger in whole, right? We want to eat the whole burger. Well, some sort of arrangement is going to have to be come to, because we don't want to split it in half. Now, some physical objects we might call super abundant, air and water, so they're a lot harder to put into any sort of like property arrangement, like the ocean, which is de facto commons by its size, and the air. But again, it's only super abundant. It's not actually limitless. It's just for all practical purposes limitless. But if we look at, say, an idea, let's say either an idea of a number like the number 1, or the idea contained in a book, or a patent idea. Now, if I were to contemplate any one of those ideas and attempt to put it, we'll just contemplate it, and then also attempt to put it to use by putting it into some sort of, action or practical reality. And then the same friend and I who had a dispute over a cheeseburger also wants to do that. What do we notice? There is no conflict. That's actually the entire point of Kinsella's Against Intellectual Property, i.e. intellectual property isn't property because it isn't scarce. But what that actually proves is it isn't material, because material things are scarce, because we can't all use it. If, again, going back to the cheeseburger analogy. Now, does it diminish the supply? I mean, if we could somehow orchestrate a situation where the entire human race contemplated the number one, do we have a diminution in the supply of oneness for human minds to contemplate? No. Does any one human mind contemplating the number one exclude any other human mind from contemplating the number one? No. Okay, well, this obviously proves that it's not material, because back to the cheeseburger analogy, that would have a real problem. The whole world couldn't eat that cheeseburger. So what do? Well, the only rational conclusion is that ideas are not scarce, and therefore ideas are not physical. It's a basic logical application. And I don't know how people can't see this. It's absolutely insane to me. I mean, material goods have supply. Like, there's a fixed amount that if you consume, it's gone. And so that's one aspect. But the other aspect is, for me to consume or use or whatever some physical good, I'm therefore denying someone else that access, because I'm taking up the space that you would have to use it, and I'm using it. Nothing like that happens with mental objects. This is so patently obvious, and was obvious to all of humanity until 100 years ago, that this is ludicrous. But nonetheless, this very simple insight is denied by all reductive physicalists. Now we have the other problem of identity, the problem of mind, as they call in philosophy. A very good article to read on this is the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy's Dualism in Mind, to which I'm heavily indebted for this next argument. In logic, there are three central axioms that govern thought: the law of identity, that A is identical to A, or A is identical to B. And then I'll define that, because that's the one that's really important: the law of the excluded middle and the law of non-contradiction. The one that matters is the law of identity, which has been known for quite some time. Leibniz had his own further clarification, and it's the Leibnizian law of identity that I'm going to use, which goes as follows: A is identical to B if and only if A and B share all the same properties P at some time T. So, for example, the President of the United States is identical to Joe Biden if and only if Joe Biden and the President of the United States share all the same properties P at any given time T, which is true. So Joe Biden is identical to the President of the United States and vice versa. Now, if A and B do not, if even in one property P at any given time T, B does not share something that A has, B is not identical to A. It might be very similar to A, but not identical to A. So this will be the key line of investigation when we discuss the idea of mind-brain identity, which is an axiomatic assumption of reductive physicalism. And is also an axiomatic assumption of AI, which is why I believe AI is impossible, at least under the conception of modern scientific technical thinking. Now, okay, how can we use thought experiments to illustrate these distinctions? Well, there's three, and I call them the three I's: indivisibility, indubitability, and incorrigibility. So what do these mean? Well, indivisibility is pretty self-explanatory. You can't divide or cut into parts. Indubitability means doubt. You cannot doubt the thing. And then incorrigibility, in common parlance and in the vernacular, incorrigible means someone who is unable to be taught and recalcitrant. That's not what it means in this context. It means that one is the only one who is in possession of his own mental states. So I am incorrigible with regards to my own mental states because I am the only one that has knowledge of those mental states. Okay, so how can we use these to illustrate that the mind and the brain are not identical? Mental objects cannot, the first two come directly from Descartes in his Meditations. So the idea is a physical object can be divided. We can, presumably after the person is dead, you can cut the brain into pieces and then analyze those pieces. Or you can say, because this is the brain-mind problem, or any other physical object you can cut into pieces. You can weigh, you can get the texture of, you can get the color of, you can do all these things to engage with the physical object. Can you do that with the mind? Or more specifically, can you do that with mental states? The answer is no. So, for example, if I wanted to ask, what is the measurements of the prefrontal cortex of John? That's an answerable question. Because not all brains are the same size. And if you go into a CAT scan, somebody could say, okay, this is the size of his prefrontal cortex. If I were to say, what is the size of your memory of yesterday's lunch? That mental state. That's absurd. You would say that's a nonsensical, meaningless question. You would say, okay, what is the smell of the qualia of your pain? Qualia is a technical term which means the feeling or subjective experience within the subjective mental state of the person experiencing it. It's meaningless. Qualia don't have color. It's meaningless to ask what's the color of a qualia. So the question is, things like divisibility, texture, color, taste, none of these things are relevant to mental states. I mean, people can eat cow brains, so brains do have a taste. So, or like in Indiana Jones, they're eating human brains and monkey skulls or something. They have a taste if you wanted to eat a brain, not that you should. There's no taste to an idea. All of these tactile realities don't exist. But mental states are real. I mean, qualia mental states are very real. If someone's in pain and they tell you, I'm having the sensation of pain, that's just real. That is what it is. It's kind of a sui generis. You can't really, it explains itself. And so clearly there are properties, P, such as divisibility, texture, taste, touch, that mental states don't have, but a brain does. So clearly there's no identity established here. The other one is indubitability, doubt. Famously, Descartes said, cogito ergo sum, I think therefore I am. The idea being that in his process of epistemic questioning, that the one thing he couldn't doubt was his own self. Because even if he believed that his senses were being deceived by a demon or an evil god or whatever, often modern examples would be a mad scientist or a brain in a jar, there's still a brain in a jar, there's still a self being deceived. So now there's an argument that was made by Alvin Plantinga that using the concept of modal logic is just the logic of possibilities. So, for example, humans have a range of possibilities that are not shared with, say, raptors, birds of prey. Right? One set of possibilities that the raptor can fly or not fly. It might not fly if it's injured, which is a possibility. Its wings are injured, right? There's no possible reality in which a human's wing is injured. We don't have wings. We have a different set of modal properties. In that sense, that would be an identity quality. Do you have the same kinds of modal properties? And so Plantinga argues that, let's imagine, for example, Franz Kafka's The Metamorphosis. A man wakes up in a beetle body. It might plausibly be the case that his body's not there. And then we can read a story that plays upon this thought experiment. It's also common in science fiction where people have their brains swapped. The fact that it's even conceivable, even if it isn't actually practical, indicates that there is a modal property that you might not have the body you're born in, but not that, so you could say your mind is in someone else's body or in something else entirely, maybe a synthetic body, like a brain in a jar. But if your body had no mind or brain or someone else's, that wouldn't be you. So, you can't doubt that. You could doubt that you have your body or some other body. And in fact, we know this is possible because every 7 to 10 years, all the cells in your body change. Now, this gets into the whole ship of Theseus argument. How many planks do you have to change in the ship of Theseus before it's not Theseus' ship? But without going into that, we do know that every 7 to 10 years, you have basically a new body from the one 7 to 10 years ago. So that can change, but and be totally replaced. But your mind is still there. And so Planning's ultimate argument is that which could possibly be is not the same as that which could not possibly be. And the argument then goes, since we can't doubt our mind, but we can doubt our body or any given set of bodies we might have, that's a lack of identity established. The two are therefore not identical. And this is a more advanced commentary on Descartes. Because what Descartes is saying is, well, we can doubt our bodies, but we can't doubt our minds. Therefore, minds and bodies are not identical. Hence why Descartes was a substance dualist. And then we have incorrigibility, which is basically you are alone in possession of the facts of your own mental states. Now, to add to this, we have the concept of public and private knowledge. Public knowledge is that knowledge which is available through the senses to any qualified expert. So for any given set of brain states an individual may or may not have, that person could be investigated by trained professionals using the appropriate equipment and could then observe and describe those states, i.e. they're public. Whereas mental states are in no way like that. There's no way that you could do that. The only way that you could know about my mental state or anyone else's is if they were to somehow communicate that to you. That could either be through speech, sign language, writing it down on paper, an email, whatever. But there's nothing that now, if you get to know somebody well enough and people develop patterns of behavior, you can understand, hey, well, this is that person. This is what they do. But you're not really reading their mental states. You're looking at a whole ensemble of cues from this person to understand what they might be doing in any given situation. And presumably they've already told you about private mental states before, so you have something to go on. But like if it was like sight unseen, just some stranger, like say someone who went to the doctors for a CAT scan, you couldn't do that. And so again, a lack of identity is established. Mental states are private. They are not known to anyone else unless you communicate it to them. Brain states are. Now, there is a hurdle. There's a threshold. You have to have the training and you have to have the equipment, which is necessary. But again, on these three grounds, we have demonstrated logically, necessarily, that brain states and mental states are not identical. Therefore, no mind-brain identity exists. These arguments have never been refuted. They can't be refuted. You go to the Internet Encyclopedia of Philosophy, they don't really have hardly any counter-arguments. A few, kind of weak, flimsy. The Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, I've looked, they don't talk about this either. They just refuse to talk about it. Which again is ridiculous. I think there's also why Descartes has been sort of sunsetted in philosophy, because he completely explodes this ridiculous materialist fetish. You can't argue. Now, incorrigibility was not Descartes' concept. It was indubitability and indivisibility. But still, that's two of the three. And he was using these before Leibniz, but Leibniz helps contextualize this. So I think that's one reason, though not the only one. And the other thing with incorrigibility, or sorry, not incorrigibility, mental states and brain states, for any given set of brain states, it's like certain neurons firing, you could have more than one corresponding mental state. There are, in fact, more mental states than there are brain states. So again, that's another reason why they're not identical, because you should have the same amount of both. So all of this should be widely known. It's not. I first came across these, the arguments of Leibniz's law and the three I's of mind-brain identity issue. I first came across right after college, 2011, 2012. Some of these were explained with regards to Plantinga. Plantinga helped repopularize a lot of these arguments. He's been around since the 70s. And as far as I know, nobody else has made the scarcity argument. So on the grounds of the law of identity and scarcity, ideas, mental states, the mind are not physical. This is clearly ridiculous. This just shouldn't be the case. But then the question is, okay, well, why? Why is non-reductive physicalism in the majority? And again, I'm not referring to non-reductive kinds of physicalism because they're not really relevant to public discourse. They only really exist in the academy, whereas almost all scientists, almost all public policy based on scientific research is based on this. Well, in part, it's about power, because it is a justification for the development of an industrial technological society, which elevates these men to the level of priest caste, essentially the modern day equivalent of the Catholic priesthood of the Middle Ages or the ancient Roman priesthood of antiquity, where they basically are these, divine oracles. And then those who can leverage that, capitalize that technology to then impose the Brave New World control grid on the rest of us. It's much like in the Soviet era, where of course these ideas are ridiculous, but they serve a political interest and therefore they're entrenched. And then of course any argument against this is just not going to be dealt with. You're not going to find atheists dealing with Leibniz's law. A handful of philosophical ones will, in the academy, serious philosophers, but not other than that, not many. And again, as far as I know, the scarcity argument hasn't been made before, so I don't know what, if any, argument would be made against it. And then the other one here is the other bad idea of the new atheist is empiricism, which is the idea that the only thing that we know can come from the senses. So let's first back up a little bit and explain the categories of knowledge. Now, there's the first word. There's 4 words we need to understand: a priori, which means before experience; a posteriori, which means after experience; analytic. Well, actually, I'm just going to read Kant here. This is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Analytic, Synthetic. And this is quoting Kant. In all judgments in which the relation of a subject to the predicate is thought, if I only consider affirmative judgments, since the application to negative ones is easy, this relation is possible in 2 different ways. Either the predicate B belongs to the subject A as something that is covertly contained in the concept A, or B lies entirely outside the concept of A, though to be sure it stands in connection with it. In the first case, I call this judgment analytic. In the second, synthetic. Okay. Now we have 4 possible combinations: a priori, analytic, a priori, synthetic, a posteriori, analytic, and a posteriori, synthetic. These are possible categorizations. One of them is just not actually possible, a posteriori, analytic, which is impossible based on the nature of analytic statements. A famous example of a priori analytic statement is all bachelors are unmarried males, i.e. the predicate unmarried male is contained in the subject bachelor, which is a tautology. It's just true by definition. Humean epistemology counts that as part of it. And we have a priori synthetic, which is Kant's addition to our theory of knowledge, which is the idea that we have knowledge of things, so of things where B relates to A but isn't contained in A before experience. What might that be? Well, geometry, for example, or mathematical principles. So, for example, the parallel line postulate that for any point above a line, you can only draw one line through that point that is parallel to the line below it without crossing. Now, the predicate is not contained in the subject in any sort of definitional sense, but we know it to be intuitively true, what Descartes would call a clear and distinct idea. It's just once you understand the terms and the concepts being used, you just see the truth of it. And so in that case, a priori synthetic would include things like mathematics, geometry, certain philosophical truths. And then we have a posteriori synthetic, which is most often considered the ideas of Science, for example, is an a priori synthetic. It's something you learn from experience by observation. History, we learn about it after it's happened. We don't necessarily know what's going to happen before it happens. With training and insight, you can have a pretty good idea, an educated guess, but you don't necessarily know in that sense. Now, this idea that the Humean conception, the empiricist conception, is that there's no such thing as a priori synthetic knowledge. Why might that be denied? Well, because Kant argues that a priori synthetic knowledge proves God. From there, you get Kant's ethical system of the categorical imperative, which is itself assumes God. Well, we can't have that. I mean, we're physicalists, we're atheists. Hume was an atheist. And it's like, well, that's just ridiculous. And it's ridiculous for a very simple argument. We have what's called a transcendental argument. And there are many kinds of transcendental arguments, but it goes something like this. Again, this is from the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. Transcendental arguments are taken to be distinctive in involving a certain sort of claim, namely that X is a necessary condition for the possibility of Y. Where then, given that Y is the case, it logically follows that X must be the case too. Okay, so let's look at the statement that they would make. A priori synthetic knowledge is not a form of knowledge. Okay, well, how would we know this? Is it an a priori analytic statement? No, because the predicate is not contained in the subject. Therefore, it's not analytic at all. So that's not true. Is it a posteriori synthetic? Well, no. There's no amount of observation that could tell you this. Observe what? The only way that statement could be a true statement is if it was an a priori synthetic statement, the very thing that it seeks to deny. So by the transcendental proof, this is a self-performative contradiction. Therefore, empiricism is false. Or I should say radical empiricism is false. The idea that there is obviously there is a subset of knowledge, which we can call empirical knowledge and knowledge of observation. But the strict Humean empiricism, which again is the universal throughout New Atheism, just Dawkins, Hitchens, they all referred to Hume on this point numerous times, enough to make you vomit. And it's patently absurd. It's absurd through the transcendental argument of a self-performative contradiction. It can only be true if the knowledge they are denying exists, which is absurd. So therefore, it's false. And again, why is this the case? Why does this continue to exist even though it's so foolish and so silly and so childish and can so easily be disproven? Again, it gives certain people power, right? First of all, it undercuts a very crucial argument in favor of God. It undercuts a knowledge category that leads to God, because both Descartes and Kant, even though the term a priori synthetic didn't exist, the ideas of mathematics and geometry did. So there's an implicit acceptance by the rationalist Descartes of such a concept. And Kant is building upon this. So now we have, and again, I'm not going to go into Descartes' ontological argument of clear and distinct ideas, but mathematical and geometrical principles were clear and distinct ideas, as he argued was the concept of God. That would be a kind of knowledge that is an a priori synthetic knowledge. And Kant's moral argument for God is an a priori synthetic. So if you remove the knowledge category that would contain the proof or arguments for God as just not knowledge at all, that's how you do it. Because obviously, if Descartes is correct that God is a clear and distinct idea like mathematical principles and geometric principles, and I think he's right, then there's no argument to be had. It's as easy as 2 + 2 = 4. Once you understand the implied terms. So they just go scorched earth. But that kills everything. That kills mathematics, kills geometry, kills other philosophical concepts that they're not willing to give up. They still use them. They still think that they're true. Otherwise, you couldn't do science. But again, it's ridiculous. but it gives you power, right? Because by setting the frame for acceptable discourse of the ideas that polite society will consider, okay, well, Carl Schmitt talks about sovereignty, the one who gets to decide the exceptions, but even more to the point, who gets to decide the boundaries? Because to even be able to declare an exception, you have to declare the boundaries, the frame that then allows you to make an exception. That's entailed in sovereignty, and in Schmitt's definition of sovereignty, being able to declare the exception is also implied the ability to create the framework under which an exception can be declared. So this is an exercise of Schmittian sovereignty over society. And again, it's 1984 Brave New World technological control grid. So again, it serves a political interest. And so the idea that the new atheists are doing this because there's some pure search for knowledge, this ridiculous, self-flagellating atheist who'd rather be scientists who'd be crucified on the tree of truth, in order for the sake of not having an error in his philosophy, is completely fictitious and garbage. It's a useful myth that was constructed for them by them in order to do this. And this leads to all sorts of ridiculous, absurd realities. I mean, there's a certain sense in which by cutting yourself off from a priori synthetic reasoning, you're cutting yourself off from ethical discourse and God, which, that's the problem. But that was what they wanted to do. Okay? But then you have attempts to build ethics based on empiricism, and you can't. Because the problem that you have is, if you are a scientist, if you are a new atheist, the only kind of ethic you could have is a Darwinian ethic, which is the idea of survival of the fittest, dog eat dog. And Dawkins even admitted publicly that you can't do that. It's inhuman. But that's what an actual scientific ethic would be, because that's the only kind of ethic that you could even attempt to justify from your scientific assumptions, your epistemological assumptions. But they won't, because they know where that leads. And so, this is a self-performative contradiction yet again. They can't actually perform. Okay, so there's two kinds of contradictions here: self-performative and self-assumptive. The self-assumptive contradiction is proven by the transcendental argument that the a priori synthetic knowledge is not a form of knowledge, could only possibly be true if a priori synthetic knowledge were a real category of knowledge. That's a self-performative contradiction. And so there's a self-assumptive that's a self-assumptive contradiction. You're assuming what you're denying. That's absurd. There's a self-performative contradiction where you're doing what you say can't be done. Well, mathematics is a priori synthetic. How are you using it? It doesn't exist. According to you, that knowledge category doesn't exist. But hey, if you're playing for the stakes of the totalitarian technological dictatorship, who cares? Was the Soviet Union bothered by consistency when Stalin had Pravda change its news every other week? No, of course not. It's ridiculous. I think ultimately Noam Chomsky described the new atheists best when he said that they are religious fanatics who worship the state. And you could add to that, Norman Finkelstein more or less pointed out that these men were, secular jihadis. They're secular jihadis that want to exterminate religion, worshiping the state. I mean, there you go. Trotskyites, right, basically. So, and obviously the consequences to this are catastrophic. We're seeing that all around us. It's that kind of reasoning that led to the war on terror, that rather justified the war on terror to many people who otherwise wouldn't have accepted it and would have made it much harder to protract. It justifies the control grid that we're living under now with the surveillance state, because, but also what it does is it prevents people from reacting against it. This leads to what I call technological realism, which is the idea that one cannot imagine a future where a world where the triumph of technology was other than inevitable. It was an inevitability. It had to happen. and that any solution to technological problems or any post-technological society would be possible. And how do you do that? Well, you eliminate the categories of thought that allow for alternatives to be envisioned, creating a kind of totalitarian mental prison that people don't even know they're in, which is even more insidious than an actual prison. Because if you're in an actual prison with guards, people pretty clearly know what's going on. They know who's the bad guy, they know who put them in jail, and they know where to direct their actions and what steps to take. Here, it's very difficult to know, and that's on purpose. Now, obviously, this is all downstream. The new atheists themselves and the scientific establishment itself is not the ones that came up with these ideas. They accepted them en masse because it was useful for them. We also know that why was it useful for them? Now, we know it was useful for the technological controllers who control the world, the world elites, the Mustafa Mas of the world, the world controllers, to quote Aldous Huxley. It was obviously useful for them because it allowed them to build their totalitarian control grid. But it was useful for the scientists themselves because it allowed them to transgress conventional morality. Now, at the time, in the early 20th century, that morality was Christian. And this is admitted to by, again, Aldous Huxley in his book Ends and Means. He said that these ideas of meaninglessness, the idea that there's no meaning in the world, which is related to these metaphysical and epistemological assumptions, that's what leads them to this conclusion of meaninglessness, is that they just wanted to be sexual libertines. And they wanted to expropriate property from people they didn't think deserve it to then redistribute it. So that's what it all boils down to. And so these haven't been addressed. They really can't be addressed. They're sound arguments. Sound argument is logically valid with true premises. Therefore, the conclusion necessarily follows. So they don't try. They don't try, which is why Descartes and Kant on these issues have just been kind of like forgotten and have been sort of caricatured in the public consciousness. Now, it's true, some people like Planting have tried to bring back some of these arguments. In fact, that's partly how I know about them. So, I mean, it's not a complete blackout, but it's a almost complete blackout. And so what do you do with a guy that you can't refute? You ignore him. And a good way to do that is to make fun of him. Now, better still is to just be able to not make reference to him at all. And they've eventually got to the point where they can do that. And so this is essentially why I'm not a reductive physicalist. But if I said why I'm not a reductive physicalist, that wouldn't have been as clickbaity a title, and it would have been harder for people to understand what I'm talking about. So that's all that I have for tonight. Let's check out the chat, everyone. We have applied virtue, gaping holes typo in the description. Thank you. I'll check that out after the show. Cyber Ninja Zero, hello. Fun Smart, hello. Steve GF, hello. Actual Physical Kelp, hello. Record Deepness, hello. Fun Smart, hello. Vingle, hello. Applied virtue. New atheism is driven by science worship, liberalism, and hedonism. Reductive physicalism and empiricism serve to rationalize these ideological positions. Jackson Hawker, hello. You misunderstood what I was saying, applied virtue here. You say, only if you assume Kantianism do you get the idea that a posteriori analytic is impossible. Kant believed that you couldn't gain knowledge of essences from sense experience. No, it's a posteriori synthetic is possible. I mean, he includes that in his knowledge category. Analytic statements are statements in which the predicate is contained in the subject. Their truth or falsity is not the result of experience. Douglas... Oh, Super Chat. Should have been read you first. Thank you. I'll just say Douglas for $4.99 US dollars. Thank you. This entire stream could have been summarized with, because I'm not a moron. Well, yeah. Yeah, true. Let's see. Cyber Ninja Zero. Sovereign is he who decides the null hypothesis. Aaron McIntyre. Actual physical kelp. Essentialism versus existentialism is why empiricism fails, and no one can abstract ethical principles from facts. So essentialism versus existentialism is why empiricism. I'll have to think about that. Fun Smart. Sam Harris totally worships the state and the expert class. Yeah, especially in relation to what he said on, was it Valuetainment about Trump and children in the basement? Yeah, I know. He just put his foot in his mouth on that one. Uncensored Pilgrim. Lol, you don't strike me as a person who particularly cares if people understand what you're talking about. In general, no. Applied Virtue, wonderful stream. Thank you. Let's see. Uncensored Pilgrims. Have you read anything by Mitch Stokes? I've been reading his books lately. How to Be an Atheist and Shot of Faith to the Head. I've never even heard of Mitch Stokes, so no. Uncensored Pilgrims. Seems to me that YouTubers are the only people debating these issues now anyway. I mean, I suppose you still have these kinds of debates on public venues and universities. I mean, obviously there was like the heyday from like 1980s to like 2010 with people like Plantinga and William Lane Craig on the theist side. I mean, there were, of course, Catholic apologists as well, and there was prominent Anglican apologists as well, like John Polkinghorne and others. But admittedly, the heyday is kind of over. I think basically what ended up happening was there was an establishment consensus that, okay, we can include the Christians now in the conversation. They have a seat at the table now, guys. And so now we've won. No. Winning is putting atheism's head on a pike. That's winning. And unfortunately that wasn't done. Because partly what was the point of these apologetics debates? Now, they were useful. They were very helpful for me. They needed to have happened, but they weren't the full thing. Part of it was to give rational arguments to believe for Christians who felt besieged by the materialist culture we were living in. Okay, that needed to happen. Good. To demonstrate that you could be a serious academic and a Christian in the modern age. Good. That needed to happen too. But you needed to deliver the killing blow, which didn't happen. Now, in part, some of these philosophies self-own, like logical positivism, and good riddance. But I want to see reductive physicalism have the same fate as logical positivism, as well as radical empiricism have the same fate as logical positivism. Maybe that's optimistic, but I think from rational argumentation alone, you could get there. Okay, Uncensored Pilgrims. I grew up and studying apologetics in the early 2000s. It did seem like a heyday, but I've seen no ultimate impact on the culture from it. Yeah, that was the other failure of the movement. It didn't actually address one of the stated goals was to sort of fortify and restore Christianity in America, or at least stem the bleeding. Europe was already too far gone for that to happen. And it didn't really work. So, partly because the problems that are causing the hemorrhaging of the churches are not really intellectual problems. Most people who say they give up the faith based on some sort of intellectual justification are using that as a faith-saving mechanism. There are other reasons that are motivating it, but it's not considered in good taste to say that in public. It sounds much more credible to say that I just, the arguments for God don't add up rather than that, well, I want to sleep with my girlfriend. One sounds a lot more credible than the other. So, yeah. All right, everybody. That's all I got for tonight. Thanks for tuning in. This is Todd Lewis of the Praise of Folly podcast, signing off.